My father tore my diploma to pieces and said that my degree was worthless. Now, he is working for me. I worked 3 jobs to put myself through college because my father said education was a waste for someone who'd just end up married anyway. He wanted me to work at his construction company answering phones like my mom did before she left him when I was 15. Every semester, he'd tell me I was wasting money I didn't have on a useless piece of paper. He'd say real work happened with your hands, not sitting in some classroom learning theories from people who couldn't make it in the real world. But I kept going, taking night classes, summer sessions, whatever it took to graduate in 4 years while paying my own way. My older brother, Eddie, dropped out after freshman year to work for Dad and became the golden child. Dad would bring him to job sites, teach him the business, and introduce him to clients as the future of Brennan Construction. At family dinners, he'd talk about Eddie's latest project while I ate quietly, too exhausted from studying after my shifts to argue anymore. When I made the dean's list, Dad said they probably lowered the standards. When I got accepted into the business program, he said they needed to fill quotas. Nothing I did was real to him, just participation trophies and handouts. The day of graduation, I didn't even tell him about the ceremony. But Eddie mentioned it at Sunday dinner and Dad suddenly decided the whole family should go. He said someone should witness how much money I'd wasted on a meaningless piece of paper. He brought my aunts, uncles, and even his business partners, the Donovan brothers, who owned the lumber supply company. He made this big show of renting a van to transport everyone, saying at least my graduation would be good for something, since it gave everyone an excuse to take the day off. During the ceremony, while other parents were taking pictures and crying, Dad sat there on his phone handling work calls. When they called my name for the business degree with honors, he didn't even look up. Eddie had to elbow him to get him to stop talking on the phone. After the ceremony, everyone was taking pictures outside. Dad walked up while I was holding my diploma, posing with my roommates. He grabbed it out of my hands and held it up to his business partners, saying this is what $20,000 in debt looks like. He said I could have been making real money these past 4 years instead of playing pretend college student. Then he started reading it out loud in this mocking voice, emphasizing every word like it was a joke. When he got to the part about honors, he laughed and said they give those out to everyone now, just like participation trophies. I reached for my diploma and he held it above my head. He said I needed to understand that this paper wouldn't get me anywhere in the real world, that employers would see right through me. He said the only reason I even graduated was because schools were too soft to fail anyone these days. Then he ripped it in half, right there in front of everyone, my family, my friends, his business partners. He tore it into pieces and threw them at my feet, saying now it was worth what I'd actually learned, which was nothing. People were recording, not to be mean, but because they were shocked. My aunt gasped. My uncle told him he'd gone too far. The Donovan brothers looked uncomfortable and walked away. Dad said I needed to learn that fancy degrees don't mean anything in construction, which was the only job I'd be able to get anyway, once I realized the real world didn't care about my participation award. Eddie tried to pick up the pieces, but Dad stepped on them. That's when Mrs. Donovan came back. Turns out she'd graduated from the same business program 20 years ago, and now ran the financial side of their lumber company. She asked her dad if he thought her degree was worthless too. Dad tried to backtrack, saying that it was different. She asked how exactly it was different. Was it because she'd already proven herself? Because she was successful? Or because he needed their business? She then turned to me and said their company had an opening in accounts management if I was interested. Said they'd been looking for someone with my exact degree and internship experience, which she'd noticed on the program. Dad laughed and said I didn't have any real experience. Mrs. Donovan asked if he'd even looked at my resume. He hadn't. She pulled out her phone and showed him my LinkedIn, and my father was shocked. I watched my father's face change as Mrs. Donovan scrolled through my LinkedIn profile, her finger moving down the screen to show him every internship I'd completed while he was telling everyone I was wasting my time. She pointed to the financial modeling project I led for a regional retail chain, the one that saved them $40,000 in inventory costs, and his jaw actually went slack. Then she showed him my accounting software certifications, QuickBooks Advanced, SAP Financial, Microsoft Dynamics, all earned during those night shifts at the diner when I was too tired to see straight but studied anyway. His defensive posture crumbled as she kept scrolling, showing him letters of recommendation from professors and supervisors, awards for academic excellence, presentations I'd given at business conferences. Mrs. Donovan looked up from her phone and said their accounts management position started at $58,000 a year, with full benefits, health insurance, retirement matching, and 2 weeks paid vacation. My father stood there with torn pieces of my diploma still under his boot, his mouth opening and closing like he wanted to argue but couldn't find the words. Mrs. Donovan handed me her business card, a thick cream-colored rectangle with embossed lettering, and I took it with shaking hands. My father finally found his voice and said, $58,000 wasn't much money for someone who supposedly had all this education and experience. Mr. Donovan stepped forward, his arms crossed over his chest, and mentioned that most construction foremen around here made $45,000 to $50,000, so actually my starting salary would be higher than what Eddie probably earned after 3 years working for Dad. Mrs. Donovan added that I'd be managing accounts for their top commercial clients, the developers and contractors who place 6-figure orders, and she looked at my father when she said it like she was daring him to dismiss that as unimportant. She told me to come by their office Monday morning at 9 if I wanted to discuss the position in detail, and I said I'd be there. My father opened his mouth to say something about me needing to learn how the real world works first, but Eddie cut him off and bent down to pick up the torn diploma pieces. He gathered them carefully, even the small fragments, and held them in his cupped hands like they mattered. It was the first time he'd ever chosen my side over Dad's, and I felt this weird rush of gratitude mixed with anger that it took something this bad for him to finally stand up. I drove to Michaela's apartment that night because I couldn't go home and face my father after what he'd done. She opened the door in her pajamas, took one look at my face, and pulled me inside without asking questions. We sat on her couch while I told her everything. How he ripped up my diploma in front of everyone. How Mrs. Donovan offered me a job right there. How Eddie actually helped me for once. Michaela kept shaking her head and saying she couldn't believe he actually destroyed my diploma at my own graduation, that she'd seen parents be disappointed but never cruel like that. She made tea, and we stayed up late talking about what I should wear to the Monday meeting, what questions I should ask, whether I should mention my father's company or pretend I had no connection to them. I realized around midnight that I needed to contact the registrar's office first thing Monday to get my diploma replaced, since I'd need an official copy for employment verification. Michaela said I could stay with her as long as I needed, that her spare room was mine, and I felt grateful to have at least one person who understood why I couldn't go back home right now. Sunday dinner at my aunt's house was the most uncomfortable meal I'd ever sat through. My father showed up like nothing had happened, talking to Eddie about some commercial project bid they were working on, completely ignoring the fact that half the family was barely looking at him. My aunt moved around the kitchen with tight lips, slamming dishes harder than necessary, while my uncle sat at the head of the table reading the newspaper and not engaging in conversation. We made it through the salad course before my aunt finally put down her fork and asked my father why he was so threatened by my success that he had to humiliate me publicly at my graduation. The table went silent. My father's face turned red, and he said he wasn't threatened. He just wanted me to understand that the real world doesn't care about fancy degrees from soft schools that hand out honors to everyone. My uncle folded his newspaper slowly and pointed out that Mrs. Donovan clearly cared about my degree since she offered me a job on the spot, a job that paid more than most of Dad's crew made. My father went quiet after that, pushing food around his plate, and we finished dinner in silence. Monday morning, I put on my best interview outfit, a navy suit I'd bought on sale specifically for job hunting, and drove to Donovan Lumber Supply's main office. The building was way more professional than I expected, all glass and steel with a modern reception area that had actual artwork on the walls. Mrs. Donovan and Mr. Donovan met me in a conference room with windows overlooking their lumber yard, where forklifts moved between stacks of materials and trucks loaded orders. They explained that Donovan Lumber had grown significantly over the past decade, expanding from a local supplier to a regional operation serving commercial construction projects across 3 states. They needed someone who could handle complex client accounts, someone who understood financial analysis and could spot trends in purchasing patterns. Mr. Donovan pulled out charts showing their growth trajectory and explained they were at a point where they needed professional management systems, not just handshake deals and gut feelings. Mrs. Donovan said that's where I would come in, bringing business school training to an industry that was still catching up to modern practices. Mrs. Donovan walked me through what the job would actually involve on a daily basis. I'd be managing payment schedules for their major contractors, making sure everyone paid on time while also negotiating flexible terms for reliable clients. I'd analyze purchasing patterns to identify opportunities for better supplier rates, looking at order histories to find bulk buying advantages or seasonal pricing trends. I'd coordinate with their sales team on client retention strategies, figuring out which customers were worth keeping even if they negotiated hard on price, and which ones cost more in hassle than they brought in revenue. Everything she described matched exactly what I'd studied in my financial management and business analytics courses. The stuff my father said was useless theory. I felt this surge of confidence as she talked, realizing I actually knew how to do this work, that my internships and projects had prepared me for exactly these kinds of challenges. Mrs. Donovan asked if I had questions, and I asked about their software systems, their reporting structure, and how they measured success in the accounts management role. She smiled and said those were exactly the right questions. They offered me the position officially with a start date 2 weeks out, which would give me time to get my diploma replaced and take a breath after the chaos of graduation and everything that followed. Mr. Donovan mentioned they'd worked with Brennan Construction for years, that my father was a reliable client even if his company was old-fashioned in some ways. There was this awkward moment where we all knew what happened at my graduation, the ripped diploma and the public humiliation, but Mr. Donovan just said he hoped the family situation would improve and left it at that. Mrs. Donovan added that what happened at graduation didn't reflect on me professionally, that she'd judged me based on my actual qualifications and was confident I'd excel in this role. I signed the offer letter right there, my hand steady as I wrote my name, and they gave me a folder full of employee paperwork to complete before my start date. We shook hands, and Mrs. Donovan said she was looking forward to working with me, that she saw a lot of her younger self in my determination to succeed despite obstacles. I walked out of that office feeling like I was floating, like maybe Mrs. Donovan destroying my father's narrative about my worthless degree was worth more than the actual diploma he destroyed. She'd proven in front of everyone that my education had value, that real companies with real money were willing to pay me for the skills I'd worked so hard to develop. I sat in my car for a few minutes before driving away, just letting myself feel the victory of it. When I got to Michaela's apartment that evening, I told her everything about the meeting and the official offer. She disappeared into her kitchen and came back with a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion, some fancy label her parents had given her for graduation. We opened it and toasted to the fact that I was starting my actual career, the one I'd planned, and worked for, while my father had to sit with the reality that his daughter with the supposedly worthless degree had just landed a professional position that proved him completely wrong. Michaela raised her glass and said, "Here's to proving people wrong by succeeding." And I clinked my glass against hers and felt genuinely happy for the first time since walking across that graduation stage. The next 2 weeks I crashed at Michaela's place and ignored every call from my father's number. Eddie sent me 3 texts during that time, each one saying Dad was in a mood and asking if I was okay. I texted back that his mood wasn't my problem anymore, that Dad made it real clear what he thought of my degree and my accomplishments. Eddie sent back a thumbs up and didn't push it further. I spent those weeks getting my diploma replaced through the registrar's office, which cost me $50 and required filling out paperwork that asked why I needed a replacement. I wrote original was destroyed and left it at that. Michaela went with me to pick up the new one, and when they handed it to me in its protective tube, she made me promise not to let anyone touch it ever again. My first day at Donovan Lumber came faster than I expected. I showed up 20 minutes early in clothes I'd bought specifically for this job, a dark blue shirt and black pants that Michaela said made me look professional without trying too hard. Mrs. Donovan met me in the lobby and walked me back to the accounts department, which was this big open space with cubicles and windows that actually let in natural light. She introduced me to Joanne Perry, who would be training me for the next month. Joanne was maybe 45 with short gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She shook my hand with a grip that could crack walnuts and told me to grab a seat at the empty desk next to hers. She pulled up the client management system on my computer and started walking me through it without any small talk or welcome speech. She said half of what I learned in the school wouldn't apply directly to this work, but the thinking part would save me every single day. She showed me how to track orders, manage payment schedules, and flag accounts that were running behind. She didn't sugarcoat anything, telling me straight up that some clients would try to push deadlines, and I'd need to push back without being rude about it. I took notes on everything she said, filling up 6 pages in my notebook before lunch. The first month went by in this blur of learning their systems and trying to remember everyone's names. I studied past account histories during my lunch breaks, reading through years of orders to understand how different contractors worked. Joanne had me sit in on meetings with major clients so I could see how she handled negotiations and payment discussions. One of those clients was Brennan Construction. When I saw the name on the meeting schedule, my stomach dropped. Joanne noticed me staring at the calendar and asked if something was wrong. I told her that was my father's company and I wasn't ready to be in the same room with him yet. She nodded once and said she'd handle that account until I felt comfortable. No questions asked. I appreciated that more than she probably knew. The guy in the cubicle next to mine was Aaron Gunter, and he'd been working there for 6 months before I started. He was 26 and always drinking energy drinks that made his leg bounce under his desk. We started this competition in the second week about who could spot cost-saving chances faster in client accounts. He'd find something and lean over the cubicle wall to tell me about it, and I'd try to find something better in the next account I reviewed. He was good at his job, but I noticed he relied mostly on current data and recent orders. I started going back further, reading through 5 years of purchase orders to understand patterns in how clients bought materials. When I mentioned this to Aaron, he admitted he'd never bothered looking past 2 years because it seemed like too much work. That's when I started catching up to him in our competition. 8 weeks into the job, I was reviewing accounts for 3 major clients and noticed something weird. All 3 of them consistently ordered more materials than they actually used, then returned the extra for credit. The pattern showed up month after month, costing everyone money in delivery fees and restocking time. I pulled all the data together and showed it to Joanne. She looked at my spreadsheet for a long time before asking what I thought they should do about it. I suggested setting up a quarterly meeting system where we'd review upcoming projects with these clients and help them order based on actual needs instead of rough guesses. Joanne took my proposal straight to Mrs. Donovan, who called me into her office that afternoon. Mrs. Donovan loved the idea but said I'd need to present it to the clients myself to prove I could handle that kind of professional pressure. The thought of presenting to 3 construction company owners made my hands sweat, but I agreed because saying no wasn't an option if I wanted to prove myself. The first presentation was the hardest. The client sat across from me asking questions about my data and my projections. I answered everything using the patterns I'd found in their purchase history, showing them exactly how much money they'd save by ordering more carefully. They agreed to try the system for 6 months. The second client said yes after 10 minutes of discussion. The third client, an older guy who'd been in construction for 30 years, said he'd think about it. When I got back to my desk looking disappointed, Joanne told me that was basically a yes in construction speak, that guys like him never agreed to anything on the spot. She was right. He called 2 days later to sign up. My father heard about the new system through industry gossip. Eddie texted me one night saying Dad had complained at Sunday dinner that Donovan Lumber was getting too fancy with their processes and making everything complicated. Eddie also mentioned that Brennan Construction's profit margins had been getting smaller for months, but Dad refused to look at why or change anything about how he ran things. I didn't respond to that text because what was I supposed to say? 4 months into my job, the quarterly meeting system had saved those 3 clients an average of $8,000 each. They started telling other contractors about it, and suddenly we had 5 more companies asking if they could join the program. Mr. Donovan pulled me into his office one morning and told me I'd already proved their decision to hire me was right, that it almost never happened this fast with new workers. He said most people took a full year to really contribute something valuable, but I'd done it in 1 quarter. That conversation made me feel like maybe I actually belonged in this professional world my father said didn't exist for people like me. I ran into my father at a construction supply expo in September. Donovan Lumber had a booth there, and I was working it with Aaron, handing out information about our new consultation program. I saw my father walking down the aisle between booths with Eddie beside him. He was looking at his phone, not paying attention to where he was going, and almost walked right past our booth. Then he looked up and saw me standing there in my work clothes with my Donovan Lumber badge clipped to my shirt. We made eye contact for maybe 3 seconds. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then closed it again. He gave me this tiny nod, the kind you'd give a stranger, and kept walking. Eddie glanced back at me with this apologetic look, but he followed Dad without stopping. I stood there feeling like I'd been punched in the chest, even though nothing had actually happened. That night I sat in my apartment, the one I'd just rented using my first real paychecks, and cried harder than I had since graduation day. Part of me still wanted my father to be proud of what I'd accomplished. I wanted him to see me at that expo and realize he'd been wrong about everything. But he'd just walked past like I was nobody, like my success didn't matter at all. Michaela showed up an hour later with Chinese food, and let herself in with the spare key I'd given her. She found me on the couch with red eyes, and sat down without saying anything about it. She opened the food containers and handed me chopsticks, then reminded me that I was doing amazing at my job. She said my father's inability to see that was his loss, not mine, and that I needed to stop giving him power over how I felt about my own accomplishments. I ate my noodles and tried to believe her, but it was hard when the person whose approval I'd wanted my whole life couldn't even stop to talk to me for 5 minutes. 6 months passed with me buried in work at Donovan Lumber, and the crying over my father's dismissal at the expo faded into background noise I mostly ignored. Mrs. Donovan called me into her office on a Wednesday morning and told me she was promoting me to accounts manager with my own office and a $12,000 raise. I walked back to my cubicle trying not to grin too hard, and Aaron looked up from his computer with this annoyed expression that lasted maybe 2 hours before he came to my new office, and admitted I earned it because my client retention numbers were better than anyone else in the department. He said the quarterly consultation system I created had basically changed how the whole company approached customer relationships, and even though it killed him to say it, I deserved the promotion. I spent the rest of that week moving into my office, which had a real door and a window that looked out over the parking lot, and every time I sat at my new desk, I thought about my father saying my degree was worthless. The next Monday, Mrs. Donovan assigned me to manage the account for a regional construction supply company that was expanding into our area, and when she said the owner's name was Bud Creech, I almost dropped my coffee. Michaela's father ran that company, and apparently he'd specifically requested me as his account manager after Michaela told him about my work. Mrs. Donovan mentioned that Bud had called her directly and said he wanted someone who understood both the numbers and the relationships in this industry, and Michaela had convinced him I was that person. I texted Michaela immediately, and she sent back about 15 excited emojis, saying her dad never trusted anyone this fast, but she'd shown him my client retention stats, and he was impressed. My first meeting with Bud happened at his main warehouse, and he was exactly like Michaela described him, direct and no nonsense, but fair. He walked me through his expansion plans and asked detailed questions about how Donovan Lumber could support his growth. And by the end of the meeting, we'd outlined a supply agreement that would benefit both companies. Driving back to the office, I felt like maybe the universe was finally giving me wins that came from actual professional connections instead of family drama and public humiliation. 3 weeks into managing Bud's account, Eddie called me on a Tuesday night around 8. I almost didn't answer because we hadn't talked much since the expo incident, but something made me pick up. He asked if we could meet for coffee, and his voice sounded off, stressed in a way I'd never heard from my golden child brother. We met at a diner near his apartment the next evening, and when he sat down across from me, he looked exhausted. Eddie admitted that Brennan Construction was in trouble, losing bids to newer companies that understood modern estimating methods and bleeding money on projects that ran over budget because Dad refused to update anything about how he ran the business. He said they'd lost 3 major contracts in the past 2 months, and the jobs they did win barely broke, even because Dad's estimates were based on gut feelings and 30-year-old experience instead of actual data analysis. I asked Eddie why he was telling me this, and he said because Dad was too proud to admit there was a problem, and Eddie didn't know what else to do. Eddie explained that he'd been trying to suggest changes for months, like using project management software and hiring a real estimator, but Dad shut him down every time and said the business ran fine for 30 years before Eddie started questioning everything. Eddie pulled out his phone and showed me their profit margins from the past year, and the numbers were bad, really bad, dropping month after month in a way that meant the company would be in serious trouble within 6 months if nothing changed. Part of me wanted to say that was karma for how Dad treated me, for ripping up my diploma and saying my education was worthless while his outdated methods destroyed what he'd built. But Eddie looked genuinely scared about losing the family business, and I remembered that he'd been the one to try picking up my diploma pieces while Dad stepped on them. I told Eddie I couldn't help unless Dad actually asked me, that I wasn't going to volunteer my expertise to someone who publicly humiliated me and still thought my degree was a waste of money. Eddie nodded and said he understood, but he wanted me to know what was happening because we were still family, even if Dad was being stubborn and refusing to admit he needed help from the daughter he'd dismissed. 2 weeks later, I heard through industry contacts that Brennan Construction lost a major school renovation contract to a competitor who underbid them by 15%. Joanne mentioned it casually during lunch, saying she was surprised because Brennan usually had strong relationships with the school district, but apparently price mattered more than loyalty these days when budgets were tight. She didn't know Brennan Construction was my father's company, and I didn't tell her, just nodded and changed the subject to the new inventory system Aaron and I were developing. I focused on my own work and tried not to think about my father's company struggling while mine thrived. I landed a huge account with a commercial developer who was planning 4 projects over the next 2 years, and the contract was worth more than anything I'd handled before. Mrs. Donovan called a department meeting and told everyone that my client relationship skills were setting a new standard for how they did business, that other companies in the industry were starting to ask how Donovan Lumber kept their clients so loyal. She said it was because we had people like me who understood that construction supply wasn't just about moving materials, it was about building partnerships that helped everyone succeed. I sat there trying to absorb the praise while thinking about how my father said I'd never make it in the real world with my fancy degree. 8 months into my career at Donovan Lumber, I got invited to speak on a panel about emerging professionals in the construction supply industry. The event was at a hotel conference center downtown, and I spent a week preparing my talking points about data-driven decision-making and client relationship strategies. The morning of the panel, I walked into the conference room and saw about 200 people in the audience, way more than I expected for an industry event. I took my seat on stage next to 3 other panelists, and while the moderator was introducing us, I scanned the crowd and saw my father sitting in the back row with his arms crossed. One of his business partners was next to him, probably the one who dragged him there, and my father looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The moderator asked me to talk about how I'd built such strong client retention in less than a year, and I explained the quarterly consultation system and how understanding client needs before they became problems saved everyone money and stress. I talked about using purchase history data to predict project requirements, and how modern software made it possible to be proactive instead of reactive. My father sat there the whole time with that same crossed arm posture, and I couldn't tell if he was listening or just waiting for it to be over so he could leave. After the panel ended, several people came up to ask questions and exchange business cards. A project manager from a commercial firm wanted to know if Donovan Lumber would consider expanding the consultation program to smaller clients, and a purchasing director asked detailed questions about the software we used for data analysis. I was in the middle of explaining our client onboarding process when I noticed my father had left without saying anything, just walked out while I was talking to people about the work he said would never exist for someone with my education. His business partner stayed behind and waited until I finished with the other questions, then came up and told me I gave an excellent presentation. He said my father needed someone like me to help him understand where the industry was heading, that the old ways weren't working anymore and companies that didn't adapt were going to fail. It felt both good and frustrating, having this stranger validate my expertise while my own father couldn't even stay long enough to say one word to me. A few days later, I met Eddie for dinner at a Thai place near my apartment. We ordered food and made small talk about work for a while before Eddie admitted that Dad had watched my entire panel presentation and didn't say a single word the whole drive home afterward. Eddie said he'd tried to bring it up, mentioned that I clearly knew what I was talking about and maybe Dad should consider asking me to consult on some of their business problems. Dad had changed the subject immediately and turned up the radio, and Eddie said it was like watching someone refuse to acknowledge reality even when it was destroying everything they'd built. I ate my pad thai and tried not to feel hurt that my father would rather lose his company than admit I might know something valuable, that my worthless degree might actually be worth more than his 30 years of gut feelings and stubborn pride. 2 months passed and I kept my head down at work, pushing Eddie's worries to the back of my mind while I focused on landing new accounts and improving client satisfaction scores. Mrs. Donovan assigned me 3 major commercial clients, and I spent my days analyzing their purchase patterns, identifying cost savings, and building relationships that went beyond simple order fulfillment. Aaron and I started competing over who could spot inefficiencies first, turning our cubicle area into this productive rivalry where we'd leave sticky notes on each other's monitors pointing out potential improvements. One Tuesday morning, I got a text from Eddie while I was reviewing quarterly reports. The message just said Brennan Construction lost the Riverside Plaza project, followed by, "We might not make payroll next month." I stared at my phone for a solid minute, feeling this weird mixture of concern because Eddie was stressed, and vindication because Dad's stubborn refusal to modernize was finally catching up to him. Part of me wanted to reach out and offer help, but another part remembered him stepping on my torn diploma and figured he'd made his bed. I put my phone away and went back to work, telling myself his company problems weren't mine to solve. The next day, Mrs. Donovan stopped by my desk around 3 in the afternoon and asked if everything was okay because I'd been staring at my computer screen without typing for 10 minutes. I hesitated, then told her about Eddie's text and my father's company, struggling with old methods in a changing industry. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally, and when I finished, she said, "Family business dynamics were complicated and messy." She told me about her cousin who'd tried to save his father's failing restaurant by implementing new systems, only to have his father reject every suggestion until the place went bankrupt anyway. The lesson she took from that, she said, was that I shouldn't sacrifice my own success trying to save someone who won't admit they need help. Her words hit hard because they gave me permission to focus on my career instead of feeling guilty about Dad's choices. I thanked her and got back to work, diving into a project Aaron and I had been developing about inventory tracking inefficiencies. We'd noticed that the warehouse was ordering certain materials on a fixed schedule regardless of actual usage rates, which meant some items sat for months while others ran out constantly. Aaron suggested we create a tracking system that adjusted orders based on real-time usage data, and I built a spreadsheet model showing how much money we'd save by reducing excess inventory. We worked on it for 3 weeks, staying late some nights to refine the formulas and test scenarios, and finally scheduled a presentation with Mr. Donovan to pitch the new system. The morning of the presentation, Aaron and I practiced our talking points in the conference room, making sure we had answers for every possible question. Mr. Donovan showed up right on time with Mrs. Donovan and Joanne, and we walked them through the current waste problems and our proposed solution. The data showed we could reduce waste by 18% in the first year, which translated to serious money saved across all their locations. Mr. Donovan asked tough questions about implementation costs and training time, and Aaron handled those while I focused on the long-term financial benefits. At the end, Mr. Donovan said he was impressed enough to implement it company-wide, starting with a pilot program at the main warehouse. 2 weeks later, we both got bonuses and emails from Mr. Donovan praising our initiative and innovation. I felt this surge of pride because the bonus proved that collaboration and new ideas mattered more than stubborn pride about old methods. Aaron bought us both lunch to celebrate, and joked that maybe we should stop competing and team up more often since apparently we were better together. That weekend marked exactly 1 year since graduation, and I spent Saturday morning at my apartment organizing files and thinking about how much had changed. My phone buzzed around 2 in the afternoon and I saw Eddie's name on the screen, but this time he was calling instead of texting. I answered and he asked if he could come over, said he needed to talk in person. Something in his voice sounded desperate and exhausted, so I told him yes and started making coffee because I had a feeling this conversation would need caffeine. He showed up 30 minutes later looking terrible, with dark circles under his eyes and his work shirt wrinkled like he'd slept in it. I poured us both coffee and we sat at my small kitchen table, and Eddie just started talking without any small talk first. Brennan Construction was $60,000 in debt, he said. They were losing clients every month to competitors who used modern bidding systems and project management software. Dad still refused to acknowledge that his old-school methods weren't working anymore, insisting that relationships and reputation mattered more than fancy technology. Eddie had been keeping the company afloat by working 80-hour weeks, handling everything Dad couldn't or wouldn't adapt to, but he was burning out and couldn't sustain it alone. Dad wouldn't hire help because that cost money they didn't have, and he wouldn't change his processes because that meant admitting he'd been wrong. Eddie looked at me across the table and I could see he was barely holding it together. I asked what he wanted from me, keeping my voice neutral because I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved in this mess. Eddie said he knew I didn't owe Dad anything after what happened at graduation, and he wasn't asking me to fix anything or even talk to Dad directly. He just wanted me to look at their financial records and give him an honest professional assessment of whether the company was salvageable or if he should start looking for other work. He wasn't asking me to save them, just tell him the truth about how bad things really were. I thought about it while Eddie sat there looking defeated, and I realized he'd been the only family member who consistently treated me with respect. He'd tried to pick up my diploma pieces, he'd defended my career choices at family dinners, and he'd never once suggested my degree was worthless. I told him I'd review their finances, but I was doing it for him, not for Dad. Eddie nodded and said he understood, then asked if he could bring the records over tomorrow. I agreed, and he left looking slightly less stressed, like just having someone willing to look at the numbers objectively gave him some hope. Sunday afternoon, Eddie returned with 5 years of financial records in cardboard boxes, and I spent the entire weekend going through everything. Michaela came over Saturday evening with coffee and snacks, taking one look at the papers spread across my living room floor and telling me I was too nice for doing this. I worked through balance sheets, project bids, expense reports, and client payment histories, while Michaela kept my coffee cup filled and occasionally asked questions about what I was finding. The financial picture was worse than Eddie had described. They had outdated equipment that broke down constantly, causing project delays and cost overruns. Their project cost estimation was based on Dad's gut feelings rather than actual data, which meant they consistently underbid and lost money on jobs. They had zero marketing strategy, relying entirely on word of mouth and existing relationships that were slowly dying as older clients retired or switched to cheaper competitors. Their client relationships were maintained through personal history rather than competitive advantage, which meant they had no real reason for clients to stay once a better offer came along. I wrote up a detailed analysis showing exactly where money was being lost and what changes could stabilize the business, breaking it down into immediate actions, short-term improvements, and long-term strategy shifts. I made it clear in my notes that this was for Eddie's information only, that I wasn't getting involved beyond providing this assessment. Monday morning, I called Eddie and told him to come pick up the analysis. He showed up during his lunch break, and I handed him a folder with 20 pages of detailed breakdowns and recommendations. He sat in my living room reading through it while I worked on my laptop, and after about 40 minutes he looked up and said it was the clearest explanation of their problems anyone had ever given him. He asked if he could show it to Dad, and I told him he could do whatever he wanted with it, but I wasn't getting involved directly, because Dad had made it clear he didn't value my expertise or education. Eddie thanked me and left with the folder, and I went back to my regular work trying not to think about what would happen next. 2 days later, my father called me for the first time since graduation. I saw his name on my phone Wednesday evening and almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. He said Eddie had shown him my analysis and he wanted to discuss it, and I told him I was busy with my actual job, the one he said would never exist. There was this long silence on the line where I could hear him breathing but not saying anything. Finally, he asked if I could meet him for coffee this weekend, and something in his voice sounded different, less certain and defensive, more tired. I thought about saying no, about telling him he'd burned that bridge when he ripped up my diploma, but part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. I agreed to meet him Saturday morning at the diner near his office. Saturday came and I showed up at the diner at 9, finding my father already sitting in a booth near the back. He looked older than I remembered, more tired and worn down, with new lines around his eyes and gray hair I didn't recall seeing before. I slid into the seat across from him and waited for him to start talking because I wasn't going to make this easy. He began by saying my analysis was thorough and accurate, which was the closest he'd ever come to complimenting my work. Then he admitted that Brennan Construction was in serious trouble, and he didn't know how to fix it, because everything that used to work didn't anymore. I looked across the table at him and asked directly if he still thought my degree was worthless, if he regretted ripping up my diploma in front of everyone at graduation. He shifted in his seat and stared at his coffee cup for a long moment before saying he was wrong about some things, but he still believed real work happened in the field, not behind a desk. I leaned forward and told him my desk work was literally saving companies thousands of dollars, while his field work was driving his business into the ground, and he didn't have any response to that. He just sat there looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. After another long silence, he asked if I would be willing to help him save the company, maybe as a consultant or advisor. I told him I'd think about it, but he needed to understand that if I helped, he had to actually listen to my recommendations and implement changes, not just pick and choose what fit his worldview while ignoring everything else. He nodded slowly and said he understood, then asked when I'd let him know. I said I needed some time to consider it and would call him in a few days. Monday morning, I walked into Mrs. Donovan's office and explained the situation. She listened carefully while I described my father's request and my hesitation about getting involved. She said consulting for family businesses was tricky, but she'd seen it work when there were clear boundaries and professional respect. She offered to let me use some work time for the consulting if I wanted, since Donovan Lumber did business with his company, and it was in their interest for him to stabilize. I thanked her and spent the next week thinking through what it would mean to work with my father, whether I could actually maintain professional boundaries with someone who'd spent years dismissing everything I did. A week later, I called my father and told him I'd consult for his company under specific conditions. He had to implement all my recommendations for 3 months without arguing. He had to pay me a consulting fee like he would any other professional, and he had to acknowledge publicly that my education and expertise had value. There was this long pause on the phone before he agreed, and I could tell from his voice that it physically pained him to accept those terms. We set up a meeting for the following week to review his operations in detail. I spent the next several evenings and weekends analyzing everything about his business. I reviewed 5 years of project bids, looked at client relationship patterns, examined operational costs line by line. The problems were even deeper than my initial analysis had shown. Their safety protocols were outdated, which increased insurance costs and liability risks. Employee retention was terrible because he paid below market rates and offered no benefits. They had zero online presence in an industry that was increasingly digital, which meant younger clients never even found them when searching for contractors. I filled 3 notebooks with observations and recommendations, organizing everything into immediate actions, short-term improvements, and long-term strategy shifts. My first major recommendation at our meeting was that they needed to invest in project management software and employee training. It would cost $15,000 up front but would save triple that within 6 months through better efficiency and fewer costly mistakes. My father immediately pushed back, saying that was money they didn't have right now. I reminded him that he'd agreed to implement my recommendations for 3 months without arguing, and this was recommendation number 1. His jaw tightened and I could see him struggling not to fight me on it. Eddie had been sitting quietly through the whole meeting, but he spoke up then and said he'd handle the software training himself if Dad approved the purchase. He'd been wanting to modernize their systems for years, and this was exactly what they needed. My father looked between us, his daughter and son both telling him the same thing, and something in his expression shifted. He finally nodded and said to move forward with it, though I could see it was killing him to admit that we understood the business better than he did right now. But survival mattered more than pride at this point. 3 weeks into the new system, the project managers started reporting real differences. They were catching cost overruns earlier, communicating better with clients about timeline changes, tracking materials more accurately. One major client who'd been considering switching to a competitor told Eddie that the company suddenly felt more professional and organized. Eddie texted me that night saying my changes were already making a difference, that people were noticing. I saved that text because it felt like proof that this consulting arrangement might actually work. I created a new bidding strategy that accounted for realistic labor costs and material price changes instead of my father's gut feeling estimates. I built spreadsheets that factored in everything from seasonal weather delays to supplier price patterns. The first bid using my system was for a mid-size commercial project, and we won it by coming in exactly where the client's budget allowed, while still maintaining decent profit margins. At our weekly meeting, my father admitted that maybe there was something to this number-driven approach after all. It wasn't a full acceptance of everything I'd been saying, but it was more than I'd expected from him. 2 months into the consulting arrangement, his company landed 2 more projects using my bidding strategy and the client relationship improvements I'd recommended. They weren't out of debt yet, not even close, but they were moving in the right direction instead of sliding further down. My father started asking my opinion on decisions during our meetings instead of just grudgingly accepting my recommendations after arguing first. He'd call me before submitting bids to run numbers past me, or text questions about how to handle specific client situations. It wasn't the relationship I'd wanted growing up, where he was proud of my accomplishments and supported my education, but it was something more honest than what we'd had before. 3 months into the consulting work, Mrs. Donovan called me into her office and offered me a promotion to senior accounts manager. The position came with a $15,000 raise and 3 junior staff members I'd be responsible for training. I accepted immediately, and spent the next week teaching new hires the same analytical methods that had saved multiple client accounts. Balancing my career advancement with consulting for my father's company felt satisfying in a way I couldn't fully explain. I was proving I could succeed professionally while helping save Brennan Construction, and I didn't have to sacrifice who I was to do either. My father asked if he could attend one of my client presentations at Donovan Lumber. I told him the presentation was for major commercial accounts, and he needed to sit quietly if he came. He showed up early and took a seat in the front row instead of hiding in the back. I walked through a quarterly analysis for a developer planning 6 projects over 2 years, showing how our supply coordination would save them $40,000 while improving timeline reliability. After the meeting ended and clients left, my father waited by the door. He said I was good at this work, really good, and he was sorry he didn't see it before. It wasn't a full apology for ripping up my diploma, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd ever expected from him. 4 months into consulting, the results at Brennan Construction were undeniable. They'd cut their debt in half and won 5 new projects using my bidding strategies and client relationship improvements. Eddie texted me updates showing employee retention rates climbing and clients leaving positive reviews about the company's improved organization. The project management software I'd insisted on was catching cost overruns before they became disasters. Suppliers were offering better rates because invoices got paid on time now. My father's company was actually thriving instead of barely surviving. My father invited me to dinner at his house on a Sunday night. Eddie was there too, and after we ate, my father said he'd been thinking about the future of Brennan Construction. He suggested maybe I should come work there full-time, help him and Eddie run the business together as a family operation. I appreciated the offer, but told him I'd built my own career at Donovan Lumber, and I wasn't giving that up to work for him, even if our relationship had improved. I'd worked too hard to establish myself professionally to walk away from it now. Eddie nodded like he understood, but my father looked disappointed. Then my father did something I never expected. He apologized for ripping up my diploma at graduation. He said he was threatened by my success because it challenged everything he believed about how the world works. He'd taken that fear out on me in the worst possible way, destroying something I'd earned through years of sacrifice and hard work. He couldn't undo what he did, but he wanted me to know he was wrong and he was proud of what I'd accomplished. His voice cracked slightly when he said the last part, and I realized how much it cost him to admit he'd been so completely wrong. I didn't forgive him immediately because that hurt ran too deep. The memory of him tearing my diploma into pieces in front of everyone still made my chest tight when I thought about it. But I acknowledged his apology and told him we could keep building from here. Our relationship would never be perfect or easy, but maybe it could be honest, which was more than I thought possible a year ago. Eddie looked relieved that we weren't fighting, and my father just nodded quietly. 6 months after I started consulting, Brennan Construction was stable and profitable again. My father implemented the last of my major recommendations, including hiring a full-time project coordinator to handle scheduling and client communication. Eddie took over creating a digital marketing presence because he was actually good at social media and website management, even though my father initially thought it was a waste of time. The company's online reviews improved and younger clients started reaching out because Brennan Construction finally looked professional and modern instead of outdated. I transitioned from active weekly consulting to quarterly check-ins. This gave me back my evenings and weekends while ensuring Brennan Construction stayed on track with the systems I'd built. My father paid my final consulting invoice without complaint and added a bonus with a note that said worth every penny. I framed that note and hung it in my home office next to my replacement diploma, which the university had issued 3 weeks after graduation. The torn pieces of the original were long gone, but I didn't need them anymore. A year and a half after graduation, I was thriving at Donovan Lumber with a senior management position and a salary that would have seemed impossible when I was working 3 jobs through college. My father's company was successful again using strategies I developed, and Eddie was finally getting recognition for his actual contributions instead of just being the golden child who did whatever Dad said. Our family dinners were less tense, though my father and I would probably never have an easy relationship. We were both too stubborn, and we'd hurt each other too much for things to be simple. But we were trying, which was something. I was sitting in my office at Donovan Lumber when my father called to ask my advice on a potential merger opportunity with a smaller construction company. He walked me through the details and asked what I thought about the financial projections and timeline. I helped him think through the pros and cons, pointing out risks he hadn't considered and opportunities he was undervaluing. After we hung up, I looked at the replacement diploma on my wall next to my promotion letters and the framed note from my final consulting invoice. I didn't need his validation anymore, but it was nice that he finally saw what I'd known all along. My education and expertise were never worthless, and I'd proved it by succeeding on my own terms while still choosing to help him when he finally asked. Life wasn't perfect, but I'd built a career I was proud of, maintained my boundaries with family, and showed my father that his daughter with the worthless degree saved his entire business. That felt like the best kind of vindication.